He thought he had won. The rancher, with all his wealth and pride, believed he had conquered another night, another game, another heart. But when the widow removed her wig, the laughter in his throat froze to ash. In that moment, his life, his arrogance, his very identity was stripped bare. This is their story. The air that evening was thick with dust and pride, the kind of air that clings to the back of your throat and makes you taste the earth itself. The county fairgrounds were alive with sound, boots shuffling over the packed dirt, the restless lowing of cattle pinned up behind wooden rails, and the auctioneer's voice echoing like a drumbeat that refused to stop. Lanterns swung from beams overhead, throwing restless shadows across the crowd, and somewhere, just beyond the chatter, the faint strains of a fiddle fought to be heard. This was no ordinary auction. 4 or 5 counties in every direction. This was the night when names were made and reputations were secured. The wealthy came not only to buy, but to be seen. Men in tailored coats and polished boots, women with their hair pinned up high, their laughter carrying like bells across the night. Money would change hands. Yes, but so would respect, envy, and whispers that lasted far longer than any animal bought or sold. And, standing at the very center of it all, was Clint Dawson, the richest rancher the county had ever seen. Clint was a man who never had to announce his presence. He was 6 feet of swagger wrapped in a black Stetson, his belt buckle catching the lamplight like a challenge to anyone daring enough to stare too long. His ranch stretched wider than the horizon, and his cattle herd were so vast folks said you could ride for a day across his land and never see the same steer twice. Men nodded to him, women glanced his way, and Clint walked through it all like a king surveying his court. Every nod he gave to the auctioneer was slow, deliberate, and dripping with confidence. When Clint raised his hand to bid, others lowered theirs, not because they couldn't afford to play, but because they knew they couldn't afford to lose. Competing with Clint was like wrestling a river. You could thrash and fight, but you would be swept away all the same. And he liked it that way. He fed on their silence, thrived on their submission. Tonight, like every night, he intended to remind them that money was power and he owned both. But while Clint soaked in the glow of his own importance, not every eye in that fairground turned his way. Tucked at the edge of the benches, with a lamplight barely touched, sat Mary Whitfield, the widow. She wore black still, though her husband had been gone for years, the fabric of her shawl draped neatly around her shoulders. Her posture was straight, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, as though she carried some private weight she dared not set down. Folks barely noticed her anymore. Some pitied her, whispering about her debts and the farm she struggled to hold together. Others dismissed her as a shadow, a relic of a life already spent. She did not laugh, did not gossip, did not join the circles of women passing judgment on each other's pearls. And perhaps that was why Clint had never paid her any mind. To a man like him, the world was divided neatly between those who mattered and those who didn't. The widow fell in the second camp, silent, forgettable, invisible. She was the kind of person you walked past without turning your head, the kind of person the crowd swallowed whole. Yet that night, with the auctioneer's hammer falling hard, with cattle sold and fortunes shifting like cards in a gambler's hand, the quiet figure at the edge of the crowd and the man at its center were already being drawn into a collision neither of them expected. The stage was set, though neither could see it. The dust rose higher as the auction rolled on, swirling in the lantern light like smoke from some unseen fire. Horses whinnied, men shouted, coins clinked, and over it all, Clint's voice rang out, smooth as whiskey. He was the undisputed king of the night, the one everyone watched, the one no one dared to challenge. And just beyond his shadow, unnoticed, the widow sat like a stone in a rushing river, still, steady, unmoved. In the noise of the auction grounds, few realized that the most important moment of the evening wasn't happening under the gavel, but in the silent crossing of 2 lives that had yet to see each other clearly. One was a man whose pride filled every corner of the fairgrounds. The other, a woman who carried secrets heavier than grief. And before the night was over, pride and grief would meet in a way that would shake the very foundations of Clint Dawson's world. The auction wound down slowly, like a storm that had spent its fury, yet still rumbled on the horizon. Men leaned against fence posts with drinks in their hands. Women gathered in small circles, whispering about who had bought what, and the smell of dust mixed with roasted meat drifted through the cooling evening air. The gavel had fallen for the last time, but the real games of the night had only begun. For men like Clint Dawson, the livestock and money were just a prologue. The true sport came after, in the show of power, the stories told too loudly, the laughter that carried across the fairgrounds like gunfire. Every auction ended the same way, pockets heavy with wagers, egos swelling, reputations polished or ruined in a matter of hours. Clint stood at the center of one such circle, hat tipped back, boots planted wide, as he drained the last of his whiskey. Around him, his companions laughed a little too eagerly, slapped him on the back a little too hard, and told stories they hoped he'd find amusing. They clung to him the way smaller stars circle a burning sun. Clint loved it, this orbit of admiration, this constant reminder that he was the man to beat, the man no one ever did beat. It was in this circle, between the rattle of coins and the clink of glass, that the spark was struck. One of the younger ranch hands, red-cheeked from drink and too bold for his own good, leaned in and let a thought slip past his lips. He said the widow was too proud to let any man close. Said she sat alone every Sunday in the last pew, wore her black shawl like armor, and kept her farm just barely alive with her own two hands. Said she had turned down men before, men who weren't nearly as wealthy or persuasive as Clint Dawson. And then he laughed, shaking his head, as though the very idea of anyone winning her company was nothing but a joke. The laughter caught in the circle like dry grass, catching flame. A few chuckled, a few shook their heads, and one man, already 2 cups past good sense, leaned closer to Clint with a grin that dared. "Tell you what," he said, voice half a whisper, half a challenge. "You think you're as untouchable as you claim? Then walk the widow home. Win her trust. Stay the night under her roof. Do that, and we'll call you king of more than just cattle." For a moment, the air seemed to still. The men waited, breaths held behind crooked smiles, watching to see if Clint would wave the wager aside. After all, what prideful man would lower himself to chase after a woman half the county pitied and the other half ignored? But Clint Dawson was not the kind of man to turn from a challenge. His pride was a living thing, always hungry, always demanding to be fed. To him, the widow was no woman with grief or secrets. She was simply another prize to be claimed, another trophy to display before the world. He tipped his hat back, let a slow smile spread across his face, and in a voice that carried just loud enough for the circle to hear, he declared, "Gentlemen, by sunrise, Mary Whitfield won't be sitting alone anymore." The laughter that followed rolled like thunder. Some cheered, some scoffed, some exchanged glances that carried both doubt and cruel curiosity. In the corner, a man muttered that Clint had finally bitten off more than he could chew, but even he said it with a grin. And while Clint basked in the glow of their attention, across the fairgrounds the widow still sat quietly at the end of the bench, untouched by the noise and swagger around her. She had no idea that her name had just been tossed into a wager, no idea that a man she had barely spoken to was already plotting how to turn her life into the next feather in his cap. The dust rose again as men stamped their boots. The firelight flickered against their eager faces, and Clint Dawson felt that familiar rush of victory before the game had even begun. He had never lost a bet. Never. And in his mind, he would not lose this one either. But what Clint could not see, what none of them could see, was that the very bet they laughed about so freely was a trap, not for the widow, but for the rancher himself. A trap baited with pride, sharpened by arrogance, and waiting quietly in the shadows of the night. When the last lanterns at the auction flickered low and the crowd began to thin, Clint Dawson made his move. The laughter of his drinking companions still rang in his ears, their bet heavy on his shoulders like a spur digging into his side. Pride wouldn't let him walk away. He would see this through. The widow Mary Whitfield was still where she had been all evening, sitting at the far edge of the wooden benches, as though the noise and commotion of the auction had never touched her. Her posture hadn't shifted. Her shawl was still drawn close, her gloved hands folded one over the other. To most, she looked like a statue left behind after the crowd moved on. But to Clint, tonight, she was the prize that would prove his power once again. He strode across the dirt yard, boots grinding into the gravel, his silhouette cutting across the dim light. A few men turned their heads, curious, knowing exactly what he was about to do. Whispers rippled, but Clint only squared his shoulders and walked on. He had the confidence of a man who had never been refused. When he stopped in front of her, Mary lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met his gray, still unblinking. They weren't wide with surprise, nor softened with flattery. They were calm, steady, and piercing, like storm clouds that warned of rain long before the first drop fell. For the first time that night, Clint felt the faintest crack in his armor. She did not fidget, did not smile, did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it stretch, let him stand there with all his wealth and pride, while she regarded him like a man she had already measured and found wanting. Finally, with the smallest incline of her head, Mary rose from the bench. Her shawl slipped slightly as she stood, and in the lantern glow, the outline of her frame seemed frilier than Clint had expected. Yet her presence was anything but weak. She did not wait for him to offer his arm, but when he did, she placed her hand lightly in his, more out of form than trust. The two of them walked past the pens and the emptying fairgrounds, the sound of their steps falling into rhythm, though their intentions could not have been more different. Clint thought of the wager, of the smirking faces watching from the shadows. He thought of the triumph he'd carry back with him by morning. But as he felt the measured weight of her hand on his arm, he realized she was not leaning on him. She was simply walking beside him, her back straight, her head high. They reached her farmhouse at the edge of town, a modest place with shutters worn from wind and paint faded by years of sun. Clint expected her to hurry inside, to fuss nervously with the door, to thank him with shy gratitude. But Mary stopped on the porch, turned to face him, and stood still in the silence of the night. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her gaze rested on him with quiet intensity, and it was he who felt the urge to speak, to break the weight pressing in from all sides. He opened his mouth to make some polished remark, some easy charm he had used 100 times before, but the words caught. Because standing there under the thin light of the moon, the widow did not look like a woman to be won. She looked like a woman waiting to see if he would reveal himself. Clint swallowed hard, masking the sudden unease behind a practiced smile. He reminded himself of the bet, of the men laughing at the saloon, of the pride that demanded he win no matter the cost. But deep in his chest, a strange feeling stirred, something he hadn't expected, something sharp and unsettling. For the first time in years, Clint Dawson felt like the one being measured. The door creaked as Mary Whitfield pushed it open, her hand lingering on the frame as though she weighed the decision to let Clint Dawson cross her threshold. For an instant, the night air pressed between them like a question. Then she stepped aside, and Clint walked in. Her farmhouse smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. The furnishings were simple, worn with use, yet everything inside was kept with careful order. A stack of books rested neatly on a side table, a woven quilt folded across the back of a rocking chair, and on the mantel above the cold hearth, a single-framed photograph of a man long gone. Her husband. Clint removed his hat as he entered, more out of habit than respect, and his eyes roamed the room. He expected signs of weakness, dust, neglect, the quiet decay of a woman living alone. Instead, he found only tidiness, resilience pressed into every corner. It unsettled him. He masked it with a smile, but the silence stretched long before Mary broke it. She moved deliberately, setting a kettle over the fire. She quickly kindled, her back turned to him. Her shawl slipped down as she worked, and in the lamplight her shoulders seemed thin, almost fragile, but there was no weakness in the way she moved. Every action was steady, unhurried, as though she were in control of a rhythm that he could not disrupt. Clint leaned against the doorway, one hand on his belt, letting his words drip with practiced charm. He spoke of the auction, of the land he had won, of the cattle that carried his brand. His voice filled the room, loud and confident, as though he could drown out the silence with the sound of himself. Mary said nothing. She poured the boiling water into 2 cups, set them on the table, and finally lifted her gaze to his. Her eyes were gray, unreadable, like the surface of a lake too deep to see the bottom. She gestured toward the chair opposite hers. Clint sat. The wood creaked under his weight. He spoke again, tried to weave a story about his ranch, about long rides under the sun, about hands who depended on his pay, about the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. Each word was chosen to impress, to overwhelm, to remind her, and himself, of his power. But Mary's expression did not change. She listened, quiet as stone, sipping her tea, her eyes fixed on him in a way that made his throat dry. She was not awed. She was not flattered. She was measuring him, weighing every word, and Clint began to feel it. The minutes dragged like hours. He shifted in his chair, loosened his collar, laughed a little too quickly at his own joke. Her silence pressed against him harder than any insult could. He was a man used to being admired, envied, or feared, but never ignored. Yet here, in this modest farmhouse, under the steady eyes of a widow the world had written off, Clint Dawson felt the ground shift beneath his boots. At last, Mary spoke. Her voice was low, calm, even so calm it unsettled him more than anger would have. She asked him a question. Just one. What do you do when the land gives nothing? Clint blinked, caught off guard. He began to answer, speaking of irrigation, of investments, of how money could turn barren ground into gold. But Mary only sipped her tea and asked again, quieter, slower. And what do you do when the land gives nothing? The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence had been. Clint shifted again, forcing a laugh, pushing back with talk of cattle and profit. But her eyes did not move. They stayed on him, steady, unyielding, until his voice trailed off and he realized he was no longer telling her a story. He was trying to convince himself of it. The kettle whistled faintly on the cooling stove, the fire popped in the hearth, and somewhere outside a nightboard called. Inside, the air thickened with the weight of things unsaid. Clint had walked into that house certain he was the hunter. But as the night dragged on, and Mary Whitfield's calm, piercing presence stripped away the layers of his charm, he began to feel like prey. And though the reveal had not yet come, the walls of her silence were already closing in around him. The night deepened. The lamp on the table flickered, throwing long shadows that seemed to sway with every shift of the flame. Clint Dawson leaned back in his chair, forcing his shoulders to relax, willing himself to remember who he was, the richest man in 5 counties, the rancher whose name carried more weight than any sheriff or banker. He had built empires, bought respect, and bent men to his will. Surely, he could bend one widow. Her silence still unnerved him, but he saw a flicker, a small one, that he mistook for weakness. When she lowered her gaze to the cup in her hands, Clint's confidence surged. He told himself it was submission. He told himself she was breaking. With a slow smile, he leaned forward, voice dropping to a smooth drawl. He began to flatter her, in the way he had flattered countless women before. He spoke of her strength, of her resilience, of how admirable it was for a woman to keep her farm alive without a man at her side. His words dripped honey, but behind them, pride lurked like a wolf in tall grass. He wasn't speaking to honor her. He was speaking to conquer her. Mary listened. Her lips pressed against the rim of her cup, her eyes lowered still, and Clint mistook the quiet as surrender. He pushed harder. His hand brushed across the table, closing the space between them. He spoke of loneliness, of how a strong man could offer more than protection. He could offer companionship, warmth, even passion. His voice thickened with the heat of his own pride, his smile curving into triumph. He saw himself winning. For the first time that night, Mary let the silence break into the faintest curve of her lips. Not a smile, something sharper, something knowing. And Clint, blinded by arrogance, took it as victory. He leaned closer, his shadow stretching across the table, and whispered the words he thought would seal his triumph. "So, Mary, am I still just a stranger to you?" The question hung in the room, heavy with his assumption, heavy with the weight of his bet. The fire cracked behind them. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Then, at last, Mary set her cup aside, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. She lifted her chin, her gray eyes locking onto his with a clarity that cut through the haze of his pride. And with that same steady calm, she reached up, her fingers finding the edge of her wig. The smile froze on Clint Dawson's face. Her hand rose slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her hairline. For a breath, Clint thought she was merely adjusting a strand, perhaps smoothing it out in a gesture of modesty. But then, with one simple motion, she slipped her fingers beneath the wig and lifted. The silence that followed was absolute. The dark hair she had worn all evening slid away like a curtain being drawn back. Beneath it was no carefully kept style, no crown of vanity, only the raw truth of a woman who had faced fire and survived. Her scalp was patchy, strands of thin gray clinging stubbornly to skin marked by illness. The lamplight caught the uneven surface, the shine of vulnerability laid bare, and in that moment, the mask the town thought she wore fell completely away. Mary Whitfield sat tall, her gray eyes steady, her face calm. She did not flinch. She did not bow her head. She looked Clint Dawson straight in the eye and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 storms. "I've been fighting cancer, Clint. While men like you spend their nights making wagers, I've been fighting for breath, for strength, for life." Clint's grin, once so easy, so arrogant, withered on his lips. His mouth opened, but no words came. His chest felt tight, his heart a stone in his throat. He had thought her weak, thought her broken, thought her nothing but a shadow to be conquered. But here she was, revealed in her fiercest truth, scarred, yes, but unyielding. She continued, her words calm but sharp as a blade. "You came here thinking I was something to win, but you don't know what it is to lose. Not land, not money. You've never lost yourself. I have, and I've clawed my way back piece by piece. That's more strength than you will ever understand." The fire popped in the hearth, throwing sparks into the silence. The ticking clock seemed to thunder in the stillness between them. Clint tried to laugh, to dismiss it, to salvage some scrap of control, but the sound cracked in his throat and died. For the first time in years, his words, his weapon, his armor, failed him. He stared at her, this widow he had thought invisible, insignificant. And in her stripped-down truth, he saw not weakness but power. A kind of power no wealth could buy, no bet could conquer. His pride shattered, his certainty dissolved, and in its place rose something unfamiliar, something he had not felt since boyhood. Shame. Clint Dawson, the richest rancher in 5 counties, sat silent before a woman the world had dismissed. And in that silence, he understood. He had not walked into her house to win her. He had walked into her house to be humbled. And humbled he was. Dawn crept over the horizon in pale streaks of silver, the light spilling across the empty fields like truth pouring over lies. Clint Dawson stepped out of Mary Whitfield's farmhouse, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his hat clenched tight in his hand. For the first time in his life, he did not walk tall. His stride was heavy, his shoulders bowed, his head lowered as if the weight of the night clung to him like a stone he could never shake loose. Behind him, the widow stood at her doorway. She did not watch him go with bitterness, nor with triumph. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable, but her presence was unshaken. She had no need to gloat, no need to wound him further. She had spoken her truth, and the truth had done what it always does. It had burned away the illusions until only what mattered remained. Word spread, as it always does in small towns. Some men laughed behind Clint's back, saying the proud rancher had finally lost a wager. Some women shook their heads, whispering that it was high time his pride was cut down. Yet Clint himself said nothing. He let their whispers wash over him like rain over stone. He no longer cared for the games that had once fed him. Days turned to weeks, and those who had known him began to notice a change. He no longer strutted into the saloon to demand respect. He no longer wagered in loud voices, daring men to outbid him, outdrink him, outshine him. His laughter was quieter now, his words fewer, his presence less a storm and more a shadow. He worked his ranch with the same hands, the same cattle, the same wealth, but it was no longer about pride. He hired men whose debts he once mocked, gave feed to neighbors whose barns had run dry, and did it without fanfare, without seeking credit. For Clint Dawson had learned something the night the widow took off her wig. Money could buy cattle, but it could not buy courage. Wealth could build fences, but it could not build character. Pride could lift a man high, but it could also blind him to the truth standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. And as for Mary Whitfield, she carried on. The farm remained modest, the debts never fully gone, but the way people looked at her shifted. They no longer saw just a widow draped in black. They saw a woman who had endured more than most could imagine. They saw resilience where once they saw fragility. Respect replaced pity, and in her quiet strength, the town itself found a mirror. Clint never spoke of the bed again. He never dared, but he carried that night within him like a scar invisible to the eye, but deep as any wound carved by a blade. Every time he saw her at church, every time her gray eyes met his across the room, he felt the memory rise again. The silence, the steady voice, the moment pride crumbled beneath the weight of truth. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all. Not the whispers, not the laughter, not the shame of a bet lost, but the knowledge that he had once looked at her and seen nothing, when in truth she was everything he had never been. So what does this story leave us with? That arrogance blinds, pride deceives, and wealth builds walls that keep out the very truths we need most. Clint Dawson thought he had won a game. Instead, he was stripped bare and left to face the emptiness of his own vanity. And Mary? She reminded us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it sits in silence, waiting for the moment to speak, and when it does, it shakes the world to its knees. Remember this. Never judge a soul by what the crowd whispers. Never assume you know the battle someone has fought. And never mistake pride for power, for true power often hides in the quietest, most underestimated places. Clint Dawson thought he had conquered the widow, but in the end, it was she who conquered him.